All right. Good morning. Let's begin with a blessing for our study. Baruch atah Adonai
Eloheinu melech haolam,
asher
asher
kidshanu
kidshanu
b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei
b'divrei
Torah.
Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
So Steve has already put in the chat for us an alternative translation of 20. And Adam gave names to all cattle and to the bird of the air and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a help to match him. So let me just close the chat. And good morning.
Yeah, I put that there, Rabbi, because we had a rather spirited discussion last time. Which I have to be careful how I say anything after last week.
There you
But
go.
I did find this, which was really interesting with the comment to match him. Now that could mean a lot of different things, but it seemed to me to be very different from every other translation we discussed and the concerns that were expressed.
Yes, so Azer Kenegdo. So Azer is clearly a help, some kind of a help. It seems to me the challenge is really with the Keneged. How do we translate Keneged? And since I was not here last week, can someone summarize a couple of the takeaways? I don't want to be redundant.
Well, I suppose it's not everybody quite bought into some of Rachel Adler's thoughts, and others said, yeah, they agree with it. And some of us sat in the fence someplace in between with side comments and observations.
The Women's Torah commentary?
Yes. Oh, and I know you said something, but I couldn't hear you.
Good. Okay, so you did
Well done, David.
to study that Rachel Adler. That was in my handouts that you had as well. Good. All right, so we don't have to look at the Women's Torah commentary. Let's look at a couple of other reflections on that verse. So let's see, what did our friend Sarna have to say? So he says it is not good. I don't know how much you focused on the first half of that verse. It's not good for the human to be alone. I think our natural inclination is more towards the perhaps more controversial or perhaps not more controversial second half of the verse. But Sarna comments, it's not good. The emphatic negative contrasts with the verdict of 131 that everything was very good. This after the creation of male and female. The idea here is that man is recognized to be a social being. Celibacy is undesirable. Genesis Rabbah, that's the Midrasha commentary, expresses this point as follows. Whoever has no wife exists without goodness, without a helpmate, without joy, without blessing, without atonement, without well-being, without a full life. Indeed, such a one reduces the representation of the divine image on earth. So strong guidance that men need wives. Wives bring blessing to men, and it's written very gender specifically, but we also can understand that the very first thing that the Torah says is not good after we've seen the repetition again and again of all of the good in the universe and all of the good in creation. The first thing is it's not good for human beings to be alone. And the Hebrew is ha-adam, the human. So it's not necessarily Adam as the male being, but it's not good for the human, for human beings to be alone. And I wanted to read for you in Dennis Prager's commentary, he quotes Jonathan Sachs, the great chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Alav HaShalom. So he is summarizing his feelings about this sense of our needing to be in community based on Robert Putnam's famous book. It's now 20 years old. You remember that famous book, Bowling Alone? That was talking about the demise already of community activities. And yeah, when I was growing up, my dad ran the Temple Bowling League. And the transition Putnam documents in that famous book is bowling alone, that people were no longer bowling in leagues. And he took that as a metaphor for the disconnection that was emerging from social organizations. So here's, this is Jonathan Sachs.
Stop the video so you can wander around the kitchen.
Oh, this is Jonathan Sachs summarizing Robert Putnam. Regular attendees at a place of worship were more likely than others to give money to charity, engage in volunteer work, donate blood, spend time with someone who is depressed, offer a seat to a stranger, help someone find a job. Regular attendance at a house of worship is the most accurate predictor of altruism, more so than any other factor, including gender, education, income, race, region, marital status, ideology, and age. Most fascinating of Putnam's findings is that the key factor is being part of a religious community. An atheist who goes regularly to a house of worship, perhaps to accompany a spouse or a child, is more likely to volunteer in a soup kitchen than a fervent believer who prays alone. That's interesting. The key factor, again, is community. So congratulations to all of you for being part of a religious community. The suggestion here is that just that in and of itself is going to make you a kinder, more decent, caring person. Doesn't mean that there are not jerks who are part of religious communities. But
I don't know that.
Thank you for stating that.
well,
Really?
I don't know that it makes you that way. I think it introduces concepts that you take on as your own, that you see them favorably, and you can't. Having an idea is a precursor to taking a complicated action. You have to think about it, and it provides a structured environment for expressing those kinds of ideas, and that's again part of what defines community.
so the impact on the individual being exposed to these altruistic ideas invites reflection. Do you think there's also any kind of place for peer pressure, or
Sure, absolutely. Except you wouldn't see it as peer pressure. You would see it as what the gang is all doing together.
we're all going to the soup kitchen, so I'm coming along, not necessarily because I care about feeding the hungry, but because it's a social activity with people that I care about.
Yeah, lots of different reasons.
Yes, Barry Kipnis.
So the bowling alone is an interesting analogy, because in the early or mid 60s, when
At about 1:30.
was first married and first temple I belonged to, I was in a bowling league. We had 96 bowlers.
Yeah.
And the temple was probably the same size as Temple Chai is currently. And what it did is it drew you in. It drew you into other things, because you all of a sudden you were interacting with 95 other Jewish men, probably all of whom were older than I was, but all of a sudden you ended up attending another activity or volunteering for something else, and it was a source of introduction. Maybe not a religious or I shouldn't say a religious observance source of attending services, but it drew you into the community activities, the Tikkun Olam involvement and social action involvement, and you don't see that anymore.
So is it one of many, many entry points?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yes, Merle? And
I think we
Barry
do.
Singer.
I think, unfortunately, we're all together here on Zoom, but fortunately, in a lot of different cases of things that I'm participating in, that you find one person, that social part, one person. I participated in a meditation program last night from LA, and we each told each other we were doing it, and there were over 200 people on it
Wow.
because we all wanted to do it together, even though normally we would be together, but now this is how we have to act. So, but it was, each program keeps drawing more people, even though we're in person on a camera, we're not in person physically.
So you're pointing out too that being in an environment with other people, we feel maybe more of a sense of obligation to others. They say that with exercise as well, that you're
Definitely.
likely to stick with an exercise program if you exercise with someone else, because whereas you're quick to disappoint yourself in your commitment, you're not going to disappoint your friend once you've made a commitment to them.
Right.
Barry Singer, you had your hand up.
I was also thinking about that distinction between causation and God, the word flew out of my head, correlation and correlation. So are we there? Is the organization and the presence of other people encouraging and even making it happen? Or is it like-minded people coming together?
Yes, so I've always felt that there's an element of the latter, Barry, that people who seek out a religious community are already people who have a sense of kindness and caring as a natural part of their being. David and Kathy, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did.
Let Kathy talk and then David.
Sure, thank you. I think some of the key factors that occur in a house of worship that don't occur in other groups, even groups that meet regularly, is we have Torah. We also have sermons. We have wonderful, Temple High certainly has wonderful clergy. And the messages that we get from you on a weekly basis definitely lead to altruism. They lead to self-reflection, because so much of what people go for to places has to do with what do I get out of it. But in a house of worship, particularly where we focus on Torah and the mitzvot are outward reaching kinds of laws that we do. And again, I think the sermons that follow up on what our basic values as Jewish people are really lends itself much more to an altruistic kind of feeling and behavior.
So thank you so much. So you're kind of back where Owen started off the conversation about just what are we thinking about? What are we preoccupied with? And as we're part of a religious community and participating in the life of that community, it's giving us more to think about that's going to move us in these altruistic directions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
David, yes, please.
Having lived out here in the West, not back East, I've gone from very dispersed Jewish communities like Phoenix. Phoenix is geographically a very dispersed, there's no real central Jewish community, to little towns like Ogden and Salt Lake with a very compact Jewish community, but very integrated because we all knew each other. It was a sense of community. Then I went to Israel. Yeah, you have religious life there, but it's more diversified. And if I may point out, more polarized because you are a religious group. So it comes and goes. And you might find groups within Israel that would not show up in the United States, but they're much more religious, but we don't recognize it as such. And here we have groups that they're organizations, but they're tenuous organizations because everyone is diversified from Chandler to Scottsdale to Tempe to Phoenix. They may like that one synagogue, but a closer one to them is not something they're interested in. So geography and community are many ways intertwined. So their experiences of back east in their small communities or bowling is very different than Arizona and Utah and Nevada and New Mexico.
Terry, were you?
Yes.
Yes, please.
I would like to go back.
Happy birthday, by the way.
Oh, thank you,
Oh,
sweetheart.
happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Birthday.
It's over.
It was
Not over until,
Yeah.
The
birthday
fat
girl.
lady sings la. Okay. I'd like to go back to Kathleen's comment about what you get when you're all in a room present with each other that we don't get anywhere else. And that is, to me, I mean, everybody is very individual about what they're going to pull out of that situation. But for me, what we get is group silences. We have these times of meditative activity. And in those silences that we're doing as a group, there is something that happens. There is some kind of communication that is not verbal, that allows you to be free in your thinking, but you're in the company of others, and there's a protective, almost like a big talus around the group. And we are all going along with the program, but there's something about the fact that it's a shared experience. And even with the knowledge that the person next to you is not probably thinking anything like what you're thinking, and everybody's got their own mishigas to deal with when they go meditative, there is something in that group spirit that's not group think. It's group being. And it's got an awful lot of social benefit without having to speak it.
yeah,
That's interesting. So that you're saying there's some magic just in physically being together with others, whether they're like-minded or whether they have different perspectives.
Yes, it's very individual and very, I'm sorry, what?
somebody said got mail.
Yeah, that's
Oh, sorry.
somebody's computer.
Yeah, I lost another thread that I was going to bring up, but I can't find it. So
Well, Steve has to, just one moment.
Yep.
So, I'm thinking about a couple of things here. I'm thinking about the idea of a minyan and why the tradition has made it a foundation of prayer that we have to have a minimum of 10 people in order to have a complete prayer service.
can I just throw something else in?
Sure.
As a teacher, I was fortunate when I did my student teaching to be working under a graduate student who was doing some research. And so as part of the experience that most people get, I also had to do a certain number of hours of individual instruction and a certain number of hours of small group instruction, and et cetera. And I discovered that for me, I need a critical mass to be able to function as a teacher. It doesn't come out in individual instruct. It doesn't come out side by side. It comes out with the group, with a large enough group. And I've taught classes of 12 and 15 and 18. And I'm telling you that 18 to 20 is my minimum critical mass for me to feel successful. I think there is something in that there's a group energy, and it doesn't have anything to do with what you're thinking about, but there's a group energy that is communicated, just like trees. We talked about that weeks ago,
Right.
but when we stand in a room as trees, we're communicating something. I mean, we're all doing the same thing from different points of view.
That's beautiful. And I'll say, I often reflect on this when we say the Shema and we say Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Adonai our God, Adonai is one. And I think about how every person is having a different experience, a different image, a different idea about what is that God, and yet they are all part of the one God.
I can tell you that there have been occasions when I've been out of the country during the high holidays, and when I find a shul somewhere, one of the most amazing thoughts I've had is no matter where you are, no matter what language you're speaking, no matter what the time zone, every Jew is coming together with his or her perspective on why they're there. And it's the same words that we're speaking. And I think there's something very powerful to that.
Absolutely. So Steve Haas has been trying to get in, and then I think Becca.
Very quickly, I don't think we can underestimate how comfort is involved. Every service ends with the mourner's Kaddish, and there you are saying these words. And if you're the one who's lost someone, there's incredible comfort when you know that others around you, even virtually, are sharing your pain with those words.
I want to get back to that in just a minute, Becca.
So I'm delighted to be having the entire conversation about community.
I'm sure
This
you
is
are.
like a big gift. Thank you. So I'd like to bring up the flip side of what happens to people who don't have community. What is the, we've talked about all the positive results of being in community, and that it nurtures our values, our altruism, our collective sense of being and all of that. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I had cousins who lived way up north on the Wisconsin, Upper Michigan border. Believe me, they were the only Jews for many, 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 many miles. And they had to work very, very hard to give their two sons Jewish education in this rural community. They had to go down to Green Bay, which was a schlep and a half. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that exercising values, altruism, sense of community takes work. You have to make the effort, and you have to have the setting in which to make the effort. And so I think that if you imagine what our lives would be like if we were in this little Peshtigo, Wisconsin, where you are nowhere near another Jew, how do you teach your children? How do you yourself engage in the things that you get from community religious experience? It's a struggle. And so, as we praise community, consider what the other possibility would be, the polar opposite.
Well, and of course, that's very real for me with a daughter and son-in-law and two grandkids now in Neenah, Wisconsin. And my guess is that in that town of 25,000, if they're not the only Jews there, and there's no organized Jewish community in Neenah, so they're going to be facing precisely that challenge. I wanted to ask you, Steve, about this with the mourner's Kaddish. So you're talking about the power of the Kaddish and feeling the support of the community in that time. One interesting difference among the denominations in Judaism, as it were, is that in the traditional world, you would only stand for the Kaddish if you were saying the Kaddish. That is, if you had recently lost a loved one, or if you were in observing a yard site. So to me, I always felt like that would make the Kaddish more impactful because it's not something that's routine. In the Reform world, the practice is that everyone stands for the Kaddish. So if you're saying it because you've experienced the immediacy of a loss, or if you're saying it to be supportive of others around you. But in my prejudice, growing up in a conservative world and living in that world for so long, is that it's much, much more impactful if it's different, if it's not something that you're doing every single week. The reform argument is, I think, that especially in a post-Holocaust era, there's always someone whose yahrzeit it is who doesn't have someone saying Kaddish for them. And so we are standing in for those individuals. But that argument is not compelling for me personally. If it were up to me, I would have only the people who are saying Kaddish stand up. It seems like, then those individuals are identified to the community as the people who need special love and tenderness right in that moment. Yeah, Felix?
Yeah, certainly recency of loss has a very special emotional and psychological effect on the mourner. But I would like to point out that all of us have lost someone. We just need to go back far enough to realize that. And I think, wouldn't it be beautiful if perhaps the first part of the Kaddish was for those who have lost recently, but then at some point that the whole congregation stands up, not only in support, but also for themselves to realize that we are all together here in loss.
When I first started at Temple Chai, we had a very standard specific process, which was, okay, if you are saying Kaddish, if you're in the week of Shiva or Shloshim, stand up now. If you are observing a yahrzeit, now stand up. And you would sort of see like this wave of, the first group who were in the most immediacy, those who were reflecting on a loss. Then I think we had 3 different categories. We said, if you're in the year of mourning, stand up. And then only at that point would we say, okay, now the congregation is going to stand with you. But it did still have that visual of, you had the opportunity to stand on your own and have that awareness that I'm saying this prayer from a unique perspective right in this moment. Barry
Right.
Sigmar?
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the close to 30 years of being a congregant, I've noticed that change, and I prefer what you just said. And even my pretty reform congregation in Brooklyn, it was definitely the mourners standing up by themselves, because I do remember as a kid looking around at people. And I prefer that distinction. And Felix, for your new ritual, when the group gets to Yehei Shemei, that would be a good time for the rest of the community to stand up at that point.
Yes. Yeah, Shmei Rabbah.
That would be one option. It was very interesting to me. Yesterday, we had a service with just the Bar Bat Mitzvah class, Shabbat morning service. And Rabbi Chernow was leading the mourners Kaddish. And when we got to the last line, Oseh Shalom Bimramav, she asked all of the students to join in because, it's something that they know and are familiar with. But, her nuance was to have that be the line that everyone said together, just the final line, Oseh Shalom. Yeah, Sherry?
I come from a very different tradition. When I was growing up, anyone who was not saying Kaddish was told to leave the room.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Yeah,
in
Orthodox,
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I've seen that for Yisker, not.
Yeah, me too.
It was
Yisker.
Yiska and for Kaddish.
Also the Kaddish. Wow.
Also the Kaddish. And it made me as a young kid think, oh my God, there's something so horrible.
Oh, that's how I felt about Yisker.
Yep.
Yeah, that's here. Yeah.
So when I came here, I found this refreshing,
Yeah.
that we recognize there are cycles of life, that people do go through these periods of extreme mourning, and that we have to be there to support those people in extreme mourning. So it's interesting to hear this conversation.
So, yeah, so you could, my point is you could be supportive without having to stand, just so that those people could really feel the impact. Steve Haas brought this
Yeah.
up, and I didn't mean to sidetrack the conversation so much with this, but it is a meaningful conversation to me personally, because I also grew up with that tradition of leaving the room for Yisker. And for many, many years, when I said Yisker, I had not myself personally experienced a loss in my immediate family. Traditionally, we only observe these formal processes of mourning for a parent, a spouse, a sibling, or God forbid, a child. And I hadn't experienced any of those losses, and yet here I was, a rabbi leading the service, so I had to lead the Yisker service. It was part of the liturgy, and many of you were there. So the first of those losses that I experienced was the death of my husband. And some of you were there that Yisker. He died in May, so the next Yisker that I was involved in was Yom Kippur. And I remember giving a sermon introducing Yisker and saying, this is my first Yisker. Even though I've led it many, many, many times, I would always, typically in Yisker, we allow a few moments of silence for people to, they reflect on the individuals they are remembering in that moment. And I would always use that time to go outside, just symbolically. It was that kind of superstitious thing. I just wanted to have that physical sense that I am not saying Yisker, I'm leading it as the rabbi, but I'm not part of this community. So I would always go out for the first couple of minutes. And then when David died, it was very powerful experience to say, this is my first Yisker. This is the first time I'm not just leading it. I'm part of the community that's saying Yisker. I see Barry Singer said, so now I understand how Temple Ahavat Shalom on Avenue R was more traditional than I thought. Okay. Barry Kipnis.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion. I haven't thought about this for years. Unfortunately, my father passed away when I was 14, and I said Kaddish for the full 11 months at our family's conservative congregation. And at first, it was sort of, as a 14-year-old, it's sort of embarrassing in a way. But as the months led on, it became very comforting and reassuring, because there was a minion of maybe 30 or 40 men, mainly elderly men. And there were a few of us saying Kaddish, and it was, every day that someone, they'd come up to me, or one or two, and ask how I was doing. It was very comforting, very comforting. And you got used to the idea of being, you don't want to stand out at that age, certainly. But it was a comforting experience, but in many respects, much more comforting than everyone standing up and basically surrounding and making creating sort of an anonymous feeling for the person saying Kaddish.
Yeah, I want to read Steve's comment in the chat, and then Merle. So the discussion started with building a sense of community. Steve says his personal feeling is that anything that separates does not build community. So that's his personal perspective. Yes, Merle.
Oh, when my father died, we had the service at the cemetery, and then we were back at the temple for the memorial service afterwards. And I remember, the executive director of the temple, who was a dear family friend, wanted all of us immediate family to go in the boardroom and wait until it was time for the service to start, which I know is very common. My mother's comment was, all these people came to pay tribute to my husband. I want to be out there and thank them. So we all went back into the sanctuary, and it was a wonderful community feeling, just as Stephen said. It really felt good to be there with everyone and not be stuck in a room waiting for somebody to tell us it's time for you to come in. That just came to my mind that she did that.
It's so personal, Merle, because you know,
Definitely.
my experience was just the opposite. When we got to the cemetery for David's funeral, we got there early, and there were already a number of people who were there, and I very quickly started to feel overwhelmed trying to be present for each of those individuals, as well-meaning as they were. And Rabbi Barton Lee had the sensitivity to see how I was feeling and whisked me back to that little office building that they have at the Mount Sinai Cemetery, and have us stay there. And that was much easier for me than reliving the experience of trying to be comforted over and over and over again. Owen?
Yeah, having done both recently, that I find that everybody standing up in some ways diminishes
I agree.
the importance of saying Kaddish. And
I agree. It
not
drowns
every-
out your voice.
And not everything that happens to us as a community happens to everybody. And I always found that there was an honor in standing up for Marianne by myself, because that's what it was. It was me and Marianne. And so that loss, I always feel honored by being able to do that as an individual rather than as a community.
It's very interesting how, we each have a different experience of what is the most comforting and meaningful to us. But I think the undeniable common thread is the sense that we are together with the community, whether we're standing alone or standing together. That, back to Terry's point, we're being embraced by the community, in either way that we say this particular prayer. So I think that's an important point. It'll be interesting. We're going to have a new interim senior rabbi here in a couple of months. It'll be interesting to see what that person has to say about this. What perspective they bring. Becca, I see your hand. Isabella is writing a bunch in the chat. Isabella, can you unmute and tell us what you think?
I'm limited as to my voice.
Yeah.
I'm home with COVID.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my God.
So I'm having a hard time talking.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just read what you wrote there. So
Thank you.
Isabella said, as a chosen Jew, I would have felt alienated, I think, when I started my journey. I felt honored being permitted to participate. So Becca, before we go any further, why don't we just take a moment here and as a community offer a
Thank you.
Misha Berach for Isabella.
Please.
Misha
Berach Kol habracha
the source of strength, who bless those before us. Help us find our courage
to make our lives a blessing,
And let us say, Amen. Sheheberach imoteinu
Avotenu
Bless those in
Those
need
in
of
need of healing
Healing
with
refuah,
refuah, Shema,
Shema,
the
with the
renewal of
body,
body,
the renewal
renewal of spirit,
spirit, and
and
let
let
us
us
say,
say,
Amen.
Amen.
So Isabella will look forward to hearing of your refuah shlema. And I do want to point out how
And Haguf.
virtually all of our prayer is communal. And even in this prayer for healing, we pray not only for the individual, but for anyone who is in need of healing in that moment. Haven't done a scientific study, but I would say 95% or more of the prayers in our Siddur are plural, we, us, and our. There are very, very few prayers that are in the first person. One exception to that is at the end of the Amidah, Elohai Nitzur Lishoni Meira, Lishoni, my tongue, guard my tongue from evil. One of the very few prayers that's written in the first person. And that prayer was originally written by an individual rabbi, and it became so popular that that's how it got included into the liturgy. And if you look at a traditional Siddur, there are 2 or 3 different versions of individual prayers of rabbis that got incorporated into the liturgy. I find it kind of fascinating that when I ask people what is their favorite prayer, a statistically significant number of people point to that particular prayer. And my working theory is that even though they're not conscious of the fact that most of the prayer is plural and that one is singular, but I think that may be why people connect to it more, even unconsciously, is because it does talk about guard my tongue, let those who slander me, and that touches people in a way that they may not even be aware of. Becca.
So my question was, as we were having this interesting discussion about, do we as someone who is grieving prefer to stand alone or stand in community? And I've lost both my parents and many other relatives, so I understand that. I was just curious, clearly in the past year, Temple High must have lost people in circumstances where, how are you handling Shiva? How are you handling it? And what feedback are you getting from people saying, boy, I wish I could have had more people over to the house. It would have felt better. I mean, what's happened? Can you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the funerals are limited in number. I think right now this cemetery is allowing 10 people who come physically to the cemetery, masked and sitting socially distanced. And the Shivas have all been Zoom Shivas. And it's been somewhat less than satisfying in a certain way. You know, nobody's getting a hug. We're not sharing food, and the informal social interaction. But on the other hand, the interesting phenomenon, Becca, is the Zoom format does allow for more people around the country and around the world to participate. So that's been kind of the silver lining of the mourning in the COVID era, is that there have been probably many, many more people who could participate in the Shiva process, because they would never be able to get on a plane and be here, but they can get on a Zoom and be here. My mom and I just participated in a Zoom Shiva within the last week. My first cousin's wife lost her mom. So it's my mother's sister's daughter-in-law and my first cousin's wife. She was in Florida. Neither one of us would have participated in a live in-person Shiva in Florida, and yet we were able to join in the Shiva on Zoom.
what feedback are you getting from those who are mourning? Are they saying this was so much harder not having people around me, or
I
in a
think
certain way this was easier? What are you hearing from those people?
I think, just like across the board here, very wide variety of responses.
Yeah, well, I would like to give some feedback. My
Yes.
husband passed away in May when things were first closing down. And even though there was a Zoom Shiva, it's true, there might have been people from far away, but it was awkward. It wasn't warm. I found the whole experience of losing my husband and the Shiva and all the things that didn't happen very lonely, very, very lonely.
So there's,
And I think part of the problem might have been that it all happened in May, when before the Jewish community was perhaps a little more, or Temple Chai was a little more organized than it is now, because we didn't even have the use of the synagogue at the time. And it was just horrible. So
Yeah.
that's my take on it.
there's one perspective, yeah, and where the Mount Sinai Cemetery now, and dare I say, has finally installed facilities to live stream the funeral service, but for a very, very long time. Maybe it's only been 3 or 4 months that they finally have that technical capability. So before then, it was up to the family to have, somebody there with an iPhone trying to zoom in everyone else. And particularly when Marty passed away, the logistical support was just not there. So that
it was outrageous, because I was told that someone from what you call it? What? I can't even think of it. I get so angry.
Right.
But I was told that someone would be there to live stream it for my 2 daughters out of town. Only one lives here. And it didn't work out till half the ceremony was over, and one of my grandchildren figured it out. So it was all a disaster, and it's been very, very lonely. So that aspect.
Well, so
that's my take on it.
Well, that's very real. Merle.
No, I was just going to say that just within the last few months, I've had 2 family Zoom funerals and Shiva Zooms, and it was very difficult, but and it was very lonely feeling. But what we all said in the end is that, it's a crappy way for the whole family to be together and see each other on Zoom. Was something that for both relatives, it would have been something that we all would have gotten on an airplane and gone immediately if we could have. But we were grateful that we were all able to be together, even if it was staring at each other's faces and saying whatever we were going to say. But when you hung up the phone or the computer, it was kind of like, okay, what do we do now?
Right.
It's a very strange feeling, which is why it was very good that at the National Cemetery, when you did Jack's funeral, at least we were all together for Karen's sake and for Jason, and that we weren't all just watching it like a TV show. But it was a very awkward feeling for all of us to be together when normally we're all flying back and forth across the country constantly. And in these 2 cases, and they were horrifying deaths. It was a very strange feeling when we all got off. We all called each other. It was like, what do we do now?
Yeah.
Well, I'll put in a word for the other side. I don't think there's a woman or a man who's lost a spouse or a person who's lost a parent that doesn't feel extremely alone at that time. And being surrounded by people has some advantages, but sometimes it's something to be tolerated and barely. And
right.
So I'm not in any way taking away, especially you, Willa, the the loneliness and the agony of having it happen at that time when you couldn't be surrounded and you couldn't have your family. But I just don't, I think that you don't have anything to compare it with as far as losing a husband. You only have one to lose. But I don't think there are enough people in the world to make that anything but the loneliest, most miserable experience of your life.
Well, Terry, I think that it just depends on the person involved, because
Yeah,
my parents
absolutely.
my parents died under very, very difficult circumstances within a month of each other. And I had very young children. There was absolute chaos surrounding the whole thing. And yet so many people rallied round. I remember thinking, this is exhausting, but it's
Right.
so
That
nice
is the,
to
that
know.
is the,
It is so nice to know that there are so many people who care. So I
You're-
think it's just an individual thing.
no, I think you're right about that. I mean, the way people move in, I just marvel at how things get organized. Someone dies and within minutes, somebody's on the phone organizing the food and organizing this or that. And you are taken care of. You are cared for, and you didn't have that experience, and that's a tragedy.
Yeah, and
But
that brings us back to our verse and what led to this discussion
yeah, thank you.
in the first place was it's not good for us to be alone, and that is
Oh my God.
and at the
Okay.
time of death and loss, let's more broadly than just this COVID moment. It's one of the things that the Jewish community does best is to come together to take care of each other, and I think that people who don't have that are really, really missing something special and meaningful. And Terry, just so you know, Sherry left a note that she was totally agreeing with you.
I saw that. Thank you,
But,
Sherry.
some of you have heard this this story. I had an experience when I was doing chaplaincy for the Jewish Family and Children's Service. I would go hospital to hospital and visit the Jewish patients. And I remember walking into this room, and Dad was in the bed and his son was there. They were not affiliated with any congregation. And the son said to me, I understand, and this is exactly how he put it, I understand that there's this Jewish community that, when there's a time of loss, will come and set up the shiva and bring food and support the minyan. And it was so unutterably sad to have to explain to him that you needed to be connected to that community ab initio, not after the fact. That it's not like there's this minion of caring people that are just like backstage in your life waiting to be called on stage for their moment in the drama. And he didn't understand that, and it always stayed with me as such a powerfully sad moment. That I read in some book the phrase, this is the kind of thing that you need to be prayed up for in advance. Like we don't, you can't like have no prayer practice, and then when something happens, you cry out to God. Okay, God, now. Hi, this is me, here's what I need. Like, no, you need to, the classic story is the guy who is in business for many, many years, the import-export business. And one time he's got his ship of all of these goods that he's sending out to trade, and the ship sinks and they lose all of the goods. So he goes back to his sponsor and says, I can't reimburse you for the cost of the product because the ship sunk. And the guy says, we've been in business for 20, 25 years. I have confidence in you. I'll front you the money for the next shipment. It will go from there. So the businessman is telling his buddy about it. And the friend goes to the same sponsor and says, I heard that you helped my friend out by resupplying his ship. Would you do the same for me? The guy is like, I don't know you. This is somebody I have a relationship with for many decades, and I have confidence in him, and I don't know you. Why should I help you? So that's the analogy. We want to be prayed up in advance for the, not that we are part of a community because of what it can do for us, but it's you've seen before that the word "and they shall give" is a palindrome. We give and we receive, and it goes back and forth both ways. Vin, not new, and they shall give. So we give, we receive. The rabbis say fortune is a wheel, and we sometimes we're on the giving end, sometimes we're on the receiving end, but that's the beauty of what it means to be part of a community. I wanted to go back to the comment that Sherry made earlier about traveling around the world, and what a beautiful thing that is to connect with the community there, people that you don't know, but just because of having that Jewish connection, that there is a sense of family and support and community, and the prayers are essentially the same with some differences. And I think when I think about what you said, I think, Sherry, about being connected with other Jews across space and time. That's how I think of it. So, across space, that around the world, whenever we're saying the Shema, somebody else somewhere in the world is saying those same words at the same time. And
that's seen from Fiddler on the Roof, when they're all lighting Shabbos candles in the windows, and the camera rolls back and you see the lights. I think was probably the perfect exemplar of what you're saying.
I'm making a note on that, Terry, because I'm working on a sermon about Fiddler on the Roof. So I've started to keep track now of how many times Fiddler on the Roof comes up, because I have a theory that you can learn much about Jewish life, tradition, and values just from that movie. So thank you. That was one I didn't have on my list, but so that's good. I'm going to come back to that. And of course, the connection through time. So, our Siddur is this thick. Our services are so long because in every generation we add and we add and we add. But the basic structure and many of the prayers are thousands of years old. So it's not only that we're saying the same prayers that others in the world are saying right now, but we're saying the same prayers that were said 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. It's just amazing. Lisa?
I remember the first time I went to a synagogue, a friend of mine took me to his very large conservative synagogue in Cincinnati on a Saturday morning, and there was a bar mitzvah. And I remember thinking, as that young boy got up there and he began to chant his portion, I thought, oh my God, this connects him to every Jew in front of him, every Jew who has lived before him, and every Jew who will live after him. I was just so struck by that, and I think that's one of the first things that attracted me to Judaism.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Merle, I'm giving you the last word.
Along with what Sherry said about traveling and going to synagogues, when we go on all of our cruises, and we always go to Shabbat services, and you meet these people from all over the world, but you all have the same thing in common, and it's these prayers in your Judaism. And it's a really good feeling. A lot of people say, well, I won't go because it's not my temple at home, but it's the prayers, and you meet people and you realize how much you have in common all over the world.
It's very, very special when I've had that.
It is.
experience. So we're going to wrap up there in just a moment. I did want to say we didn't get too far in the text today, but it, you know, it was an interesting discussion. You do have pages 22 and 23 from this book on sacred ground. So I'm going to start off with that next week, and then we'll move to verse 19 and following. I see that there's a big discussion that started in the chat here. Felix is asking, why did Hashem create a world where the majority of spousal deaths are sequential rather than conjointly? So we don't have that Indian practice of the widow throwing herself onto the, you know, we each have our own body that, you know, is born and dies in its own time. In the period of COVID, we see examples of couples passing together, holding hands, Steve Haas. And, you know, there is a documented medical phenomenon of what they call broken heart syndrome. I have had funerals like this that, I don't know that there's anyone here who has that medical knowledge, but there's a medical term for it, that it often happens that one person dies and then the other person dies relatively quickly. And the doctors call it broken heart syndrome. I did have that situation this year, like in March, one of my former students died of COVID, a young mother of a 2-year-old girl. You know, it was very, very sad. 2 or 3 months later, I did her mom's funeral. So it worked that way, not only just with a partner, but with a mother and daughter. Kathy says to Isabella, there is not just loneliness and the loss of a loved one. COVID has thrust people such as yourself into isolation. That's exactly true. At a time when your need for caring is profound. Please know that we are with you in spirit, if not in person. That on that beautiful note, let's say, Oseh Shalom B'Mama.
Yaseh Shalom. Aleinu v'Yachol Yisrael. Yimru. Amen.
Amen.
Shavua Tov. So nice to see everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you.